You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Jonathan Sarna. He's a professor at Brandeis University. He's the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History. He's a director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and we're going to talk to him about his work today. So thank you for coming, Jonathan. How are you doing?
All right. Wonderful to be with you.
If you would tell me about what's your journey been like to this point? Like what got you interested in the areas of study you're researching, and what's your career been like?
I'm probably the only person in the whole world who became interested in American Jewish history already in high school. When I was a senior at Brookline High School in those days, you had projects, and my project dealt with American Jewish history. During my undergraduate college years in the 1970s, I worked at the American Jewish Historical Society and similarly strengthened my knowledge of American Jewish history. And even as I earned a PhD in American history, I knew that my hope was to work on the history of Jews in America. When I started, which amazing as it must sound, was almost 50 years ago. When I started, the field was wide open, and that's really why I decided to go into it. I thought that it would be very exciting to work on material that was so little known. Yeah.
When did Jews first start coming to the U.S. in large numbers? I thought it was the early 1900s, but maybe it's way before that. I don't know.
You say in large numbers. So we date the earliest Jewish community, which did not have large numbers, but just like a baby is important to understand childhood to understanding an adult, the early years of a community have a shaping influence, and we date the American Jewish community to 1654. There were individual Jews earlier, but in 1654 you have a group of Jews, traditional number is 23, who came into New Amsterdam seeking refuge, and that's the beginning of the New York Jewish community. The community grows quite substantially already in the 19th century. There are about 15,000 Jews in America in 1840. There are 150,000, that's 10 times as many, on the eve of the Civil War, most of them from Central Europe, the German and Polish lands, but others from all over. And then you have a period of enormous growth that begins in the late 19th century and really hits its stride in the early 20th century, when you had often more than 100 and sometimes closer to 200,000 Jews every year escaping from Eastern Europe, mostly Russia. That is largely cut off first by World War I and then by the Immigration Act of 1924. But we have had a quite substantial immigration since World War II, not only displaced persons, but we've had the largest have been, of course, Jews in the former Soviet Union. About 750,000 Russian-speaking Jews are now in the United States.
Yeah, that's my family's heritage. They came in the early 1900s from Russia and Ukraine. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that they were part of the large immigration early 1900s. And, as I say, in that period, you often had more than 100,000 a year, majority coming through Ellis Island. But more recently, with the fall of the Soviet Union, you had about 750,000 more who came there, double that to Israel. But there'd be Jews from Cuba, Jews from Arab lands, a lot of Jews from Persia, meaning Iran. And really, as we speak, there's a migration from Latin America. Most Venezuelan Jews are now in the U.S., and other Latin American Jews come to the U.S. So the community is a diverse and interesting and variegated community, even though today the majority of American Jews are native-born. There are surprising numbers who are the children of immigrants from different places.
I know it depends on which wave and when they came and where they came from, but in general, do Jews come for different reasons than, let's say, the Irish came or the Polish came, or is it all the same reasons?
Well, I think in some ways it is different, and the way you can see the difference is based on how many immigrants return to their country of origin. There were Jews who returned, but not many Jews who came to the United States as victims of persecution or even for economic reasons. Not many of them ever returned to live in the older country. A much higher percentage of Irish and Italians went back, because in the case of Irish and Italian, it was largely economics that led them to the United States, meaning that their countries were poor and economically couldn't sustain the population. That was true of Jews as well, but on top of everything else, and this is especially true in Russia, Jews suffered from a great deal of discriminatory legislation. Think the May laws, which prevented Jews from living in certain places and placed quotas on how many Jews could be employed, and many other restrictions. And that in addition to all of that, there was anti-Jewish violence that becomes steadily more deadly. We forget that hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered in the Ukraine during the aftermath of World War I and the so-called Russian Civil War. And of course, there were anti-Jewish attacks known as pogroms. And people who heard about the pogroms were very frightened. And some of them said, I'd rather live in America, but it certainly didn't encourage people to return. And in the 20th century, when the violence is much greater, the return rate for Jews is infinitesimal compared to the return rate for the Irish and the Italian. And indeed, Ireland is still full of Irish people, and Italy is still full of Italian people, but Russia and Romania and Austria-Hungary, they hardly have any Jews at all. Even Russia, which had 2.5 million when I was young, now is greatly reduced. And that serves as a reminder that the Jewish situation as a minority group, was somewhat different than the situation for Jews. The Jewish situation for Jews as a minority group was somewhat different than the situation of many other immigrants who came to the United States.
Yeah, I'm not saying that Jews were the most persecuted, but they seem to be persecuted many, many times over hundreds and I don't know about thousands of years. Why is that? Do you think? Why do Jews seem to be suffer diasporas so many times?
I mean, there are, of course, many theories why the Jews. Braun, the great Jewish historian, when he was asked, he would always pithily say the dislike of the unlike, and serves as a reminder that Jews were minority throughout the diaspora. And we know that a minority group often suffers the hatred from the majority population. There was, of course, a long history of anti-Semitic tropes in Christendom, and even before Christendom in Greece and Rome. Christianity had a kind of anti-Jewish mythology. Jews connected with deicide, connected to the fact that Jews did not recognize their Lord. Islam, too, considered Jews to be dhimmi. They tolerated, but second-class citizens who had to know their place. And just as the New Testament certainly has anti-Semitic tropes, so the Quran and Muslim literature had anti-Semitic tropes. In both cases, there also were pro-Jewish tropes. There was a sense that Jews are our cousins. They are part of the descendants of Abraham. But lots of people, especially in hard economic times, or when there was a plague, or at times of social tension, it was easy to turn on the Jewish group, and then you had this cultural legacy of anti-Jewish ideas that could be called upon. Now, Jews are not unique in that way. In our own day, we've seen that Asian immigrants in the United States well accepted and very well received and considered something of a model minority, and had succeeded in America and all the rest. Nevertheless, during the COVID era, there were not a few people who turned on Asians, especially Chinese, and old, half-forgotten anti-Asian tropes were resurrected. A reminder that in culture, ideas and stereotypes may lie dormant, but they rarely disappear completely. And they're called upon when they can be useful to the majority population.
Right. Another question, people ask me, "Oh, are you Jewish? What's your heritage? What's your ethnicity? I know it sounds silly, but what does it mean to be Jewish? Is it an ethnicity? Is it a religious belief? Is it a heritage? I mean, what is it?"
All of them. Look, the Jewish people were tribes, and when you have a tribal heritage, religion and what we today call ethnicity or peoplehood or nationhood are part of that. In other words, they're linked. Just like, by the way, we earlier mentioned the Irish, but a lot of Irish saw their Catholicism as a deep part of who they were. The idea that you can separate out religion and nationhood is a very modern idea, and there are all sorts of groups, the Armenians, another example, where the two are inextricably linked. And so it is, I think, in Judaism. Jewish culture is suffused with religious elements, whether or not people who talk about their being cultural Jews. I'm not religious. I'm secular, but I love Jewish culture. Well, a lot of Jewish culture draws upon religious motifs and is deeply rooted in Judaism. Many cultural Jews celebrate the high holidays in the fall, Passover in the spring. That makes perfect sense because until the day before yesterday, it was impossible to separate these different elements. And as I'm suggesting, it's not possible to separate them out easily today. And now I move to my personal view, but I think that part of what Jews should glory in and part of what makes Jews in a way proud and distinctive is the fact that it's all of those things mixed together and you don't want to separate it out, but you want to study and embrace and take pride and sometimes wrestle with a very rich culture, religion, faith that is 3,500 years old. So I think that the more one studies, the more one appreciates how complicated, diverse Judaism, Jewish heritage, and so on, and Jewish faith all are. And we spend kind of a lifetime doing that.
Okay. For American Jews in today's day and age, maybe this is a stupid question, but how important is Hebrew? Is knowing it, speaking it, understanding it important to being a Jew in modern times?
I mean, were you simply to do a population study of American Jews, the number of American Jews who can feel comfortable speaking Hebrew is very small. A small minority are fluent in Hebrew. A somewhat larger group can read Hebrew, and after all, it's nice to be able to read the texts, the central texts of one's religion, the language in which it was written, rather than having to rely on a translation. It's nice to be able to pray in the same language that Jews have been praying for so long, and to hear the Torah in the language in which it was written. But Americans generally don't like foreign languages. And while I think lots of American Jews know a certain number of words, in other words, their English is infused, to use a word that Professor Sarah Bunim Ben-Or has reminded us of, their English is infused with a certain number of Hebraisms that may include words like Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah and Shana Tova, meaning a happy New Year, and Seder for Passover and so on. And some Hebrew words have passed into English, like matzah, but
matzah with butter and salt is very good.
Yeah. So that word appears in the Bible. So in any case, and this I think is unfortunate. It would be wonderful if all Jews knew Hebrew the way the old Hebraists hoped, and you'd meet a Jew anywhere in the world and you'd communicate in Hebrew. I think that's probably true of rabbis. Anyone who knows, say, the Chabad movement, many Chabad leaders know multiple languages, hoping to communicate. Hebrew, Yiddish, the two Jewish languages, the only two, but they would know Hebrew and Yiddish, but many speak other languages as well. But the bulk of American Jews, as I say, use English. The good thing is that English today, especially in a digital world, is so valuable that you can communicate with your fellow Jews and your fellow non-Jews in English. People all over the world have concluded that they need English and learn it. And even in Israel, young Jews appreciate how important it is for them to know English. So English has become the great unifying language of the Jewish people. But obviously, from a religious point of view, many had hoped that that would be Hebrew. And I would say, and it's important to remember it, with about half of the Jewish people now living in Israel, and Israel's language is Hebrew, those who are not comfortable in the Hebrew language certainly miss out on an ability to build ties with a large percentage of the world's Jews.
Oh, what do you think the effects of the Hebrew language kind of going dormant until Eliezer ben Yehuda brought it back? What do you think what effect has that had on the various Jewish diasporas and the culture of Judaism itself?
It's not quite true that it was dormant in the standard meaning of dormant. Jewish intellectuals wrote in Hebrew. We have letters that rabbis wrote to one another in Hebrew. It was very much an elite language, much as church people wrote to one another in Latin. Jewish leaders wrote to one another in Hebrew. What happens in Eliezer ben Yehuda's day is, under the influence of nationalism, there is a growing sense that a nation should be defined by its language and needs to have a distinctive language. And just like the Irish bid to revitalize Gaelic, so Jews, with much greater success, work to revitalize Hebrew. And of course, Eliezer ben Yehuda and his spiritual descendants to our own day worked hard to create new words in Hebrew, words that were needed. Recently in Hebrew, they invented a word for gender and gender studies. They invented words, migdar. They invented words for privatization and hafrata, and many words connected with the with new computer technology. In the old days, what you tend to find is that people would write those kinds of words in whatever language they spoke. They would write it out in Hebrew letters, but they didn't invent nearly as many new words. Eliezer ben Yehuda wanted Hebrew not just to be a sacred language, if Lashon Kodesh, as they called it, the holy tongue. They wanted it to be a profane, secular language that all peoples in the land of Israel would speak, or at least all Jews. And that's what was new. That's tied in with nationalism. And that, in fact, is what happened. But don't underestimate the fact that Lashon Kodesh, as Jews called it, the holy tongue, was certainly in use among learned Jews throughout the centuries from rabbinic times onward.
Do you know anyone that has looked at biblical Hebrew and then looked at any available writings of Hebrew throughout the centuries and watched and observed the how the language has changed from, I guess, what is called biblical Hebrew to modern Hebrew? Has anyone looked at that continuum?
Sure.
Can you see that?
I mean, there are professors of the Hebrew language there are English books by Professor Glinert, Glinert, on the history of Hebrew, and he is he's at Dartmouth, a great expert on the history of Hebrew. And of course, in Israel, there are multiple scholars, Professor Kasher and others, who have written on the history of the Hebrew language, and indeed they distinguish between ancient Hebrew, rabbinic Hebrew, forms that come in the Middle Ages, Maskilic Hebrew, which the enlightened Jews in the 18th, 19th century use, and so on. And even the Hebrew of Israel, Israel's approaching its 75th birthday, that Hebrew has greatly evolved. Many of the pioneers of the Hebrew language wouldn't understand the Hebrew spoken by Israeli soldiers. And indeed, I well remember the great scholar of Hebrew, Chaim Rabin, who had a good sense of humor, and how it was that he, the professor of Hebrew, couldn't even understand some of the military slang that had become common on military bases. But that means that the language is growing and developing. If we could bring back Shakespeare today, he would have a great deal of difficulty reading the New York Times. In other words, Hebrew is a living language. I don't think it ever died, but it's certainly evolving much more rapidly in contemporary times than it did when it was simply the language of the Jewish elite.
Okay. Well, these are my speculations so far. What kind of questions are you working on and researching and trying to answer right now?
I have a wide number. I especially nowadays to try and understand particular moments or themes. So, for example, I've done a lot of work on how Jews felt about the Hebrew phrase that we say in the Passover Haggadah, Lishana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim, usually translated as next year in Jerusalem, but actually you won't find that translation until around World War II. I know that Jews knew the phrase next year in Jerusalem, but they were actually very frightened of putting it down in writing, lest people think they were disloyal to America. And so even if it was oral, knowing that others were reading their English translations in their Haggadahs, if anybody listening to us has an old Maxwell House Haggadah or some other early translation, they will find it doesn't say next year in Jerusalem. It has a longer phrase that implies that God should bring us back to Jerusalem. Everyone agreed that the Almighty can do whatever the Almighty wants, but it's not accident that a pithy Hebrew phrase was translated into something much longer, because Jews were nervous. In more recent years, once again, you can tell a lot about Jews by how they respond to next year in Jerusalem. Some of the ultra-Orthodox Jews really see Jerusalem as meaning the rebuilding of the temple, the coming of the Messiah, and the fulfillment of a kind of eschatological Jerusalem, whereas some progressive and liberal Jews interpret Jerusalem not as a place, but more as a condition of peace and the realization of certain Jewish ideals, which they sometimes summarize as tikkun olam, and so on. And if you read a progressive Haggadot, there's often a long explanation of what Jerusalem means. So that's one set. I've done some work and have an article coming out.
One question,
Yeah.
Jonathan, before we move on. What is that phrase then supposed to mean, next year in Jerusalem?
Well,
it means that desire to be there next year, go back, or what is it?
Well, that of course Zionists argued, and you can trace that with the Zionist movement. Theodor Herzl himself says it. There is a sense, next year in Jerusalem means we should get ourselves there. We should work hard to restore Jerusalem of old. And remember, if you were alive in the 1870s, suddenly there were steamships, and that was transformative. You could go to a lot of places you couldn't go before. Sail meant you were totally dependent on the wind, and maybe you'd run out of food before you got where you needed to be, and lots of people hugged the coast, which meant that there were lots of places you couldn't go. But once steam comes, I know what day I'll leave, I know what day I'll arrive. It's much easier to travel. It's a revolution. And with the coming of steam, people are able to think, I can travel to Jerusalem. After all, even Mark Twain takes a steamboat to Jerusalem. So the idea about next year in Jerusalem suddenly for Zionists becomes, is it time for me personally to go there and help rebuild the Jewish homeland? Whereas, say, in the early 19th century, we know that Jews in America thought, maybe an eagle will come and I'll fly on its wings. Or maybe there'll be a giant thunderstorm and I'll fly on the cloud to Jerusalem. I don't recommend trying to do either of those things. And of course, those were supernatural ideas, which suggest that going back to Jerusalem was not a kind of realistic motif, but that's going to change. And indeed, today we're close to having a majority of American Jews who have at least visited Israel once. Obviously, air travel makes travel to Israel even cheaper and easier than steam. So next year in Jerusalem can become very practical rather than something messianic.
It's amazing as you're talking about this. I get frustrated if I'm like a couple of hours delayed. And here we have people that, they take a trip and like you said, they wouldn't even know when they're going to get there, like give it or take a week or two, or maybe even a month or two. It's amazing the difference,
Totally different. And there were plenty of people who really never traveled outside of their home country. I would say the bulk of humanity in the New World. And in the Old World, if you left your country, often it wasn't you left your country, but someone captured and you were in a different country, even though you hadn't moved at all. My grandfather used to joke how he managed to live in 3 countries without moving an inch. And that was because where he lived in Konin in Poland was at different times under Russia, under Germany, and independent Poland. So, it's a very, very different. The past is something of a foreign country in that regard, and lots of people rarely, if ever, left home, and it was dangerous. Plenty of ships went down, and the death rate, especially for poorer people who couldn't afford the best ships and the best crews and so on, was really quite high. To go back to the Irish, and many of the Irish during the potato famine of the 19th century only really wanted to go from Ireland to Boston, but that it did entail crossing the Atlantic, although a shorter point. And a double-digit percentage of them never made it. And the letters are always concerned. That's the first item. Have you heard from so-and-so? Knowing that so many people didn't make it. Whereas, 150 years later, someone gets on a plane, we assume they have made it, maybe a little late, as you say, but the default is that you make where, you get to your destination.
Right. Okay. Well, Jonathan, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Where can people find out more about your work and your research?
Well, all my books are available on Amazon. Probably the best known is American Judaism, a History, which is a synthetic work. I have a new book with many articles that are have had an impact, and the book is called Coming to Terms with America. I think, it's not hard using Google or academia to find my many articles, and there's plenty to read and to study. So I hope we've whetted people's appetites to learn more about American Jewish history and life.
Very good. Again, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
All right. Delighted to be with you. Be well. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.